Okay, so we have the G-X7 mechanical purge gun today. We're going to do a tear down, highlight some of the areas we want to be paying attention to keep the gun working very well. And we'll start by removing the fluid section and center line components, and then after that we'll get into the trigger and the cylinder assembly. So first we want to remove the air cap, and we always want to put a little air to the gun and trigger before we remove the pattern control disc or the PCD, so we don't score the valving rod when we're unscrewing the retainer. We can see we have the PCD retainer, the PCD and the air cap. Now we're going to take the module body, then we'll trigger the gun. This time the module came out with the front packing. If it gets stuck in there, a couple of trigger pulls and it'll help extract that module. Okay, so at this point we're going to put the safety back on and remove our air supply. I just want to loosen that rear packing nut. And now we're going to take the stop into the service position, which removes it from the back end of the gun. So we're going to attach our air supply, and we want to trigger the gun. That will relieve the pressure of the valving rod from the piston. So it'll unscrew quite nicely. And we can relieve the air. Okay, so we want to inspect the valving rod, make sure there's no scratches or burrs on the front end, that everything's clean. If we have some material buildup, we don't want to be scraping on this with a razor blade. We want to use some solvent, maybe a light Scotch-Brite pad, and just keep that shiny so we don't destroy our mix module when we put it back into the gun. Okay, so from there we've released the valving rod from the gun block, so we can remove our gun block. Gonna support it. The gun block screw is actually captured. Okay, so that leaves us with the fluid section. The block is marked R for resin, A for ISO. Also notice on the ISO cap, we have the notches around the screen screw, and this one is smooth, so the A side always has the notches so that we can keep them separate from one another. So we'll go ahead and remove the screen screw. So the screen screw has the check valve assembly. It's kind of all together. It's a one-way valve, keeping the fluid from going that way. We have our screen. We want to make sure the bore is clean. Before we return it to service, we want to check this screen screw seal, make sure it's not cracked. Of course, clean into the bore of the gun block head. So we'll go ahead and remove the ISO side. Sometimes that check valve is a little more stubborn on the ISO. Again, we want to make sure everything's clean. Doesn't have a material buildup. Same with the screen, the bore, checking the seal. We can remove our gun block gaskets and our rear seal. So we can use a pin or a drift to get the rear seal out, because we'll be replacing that. And that's pretty much the fluid section of the G-X7A gun. Okay, so now we're going to get into the air cylinder section, remove the cylinder from the handle, inspect the O-rings, and just make sure everything's working okay in there. So the first thing we want to do is we want to remove the rear cylinder screw and clamp. Notice there's a flat and then a chamfered edge here. The chamfered edge goes to the cylinder, so just be mindful when we go to put that back on. So now we can unscrew the cylinder, rear cap, inspect the O-ring, the spring. The G-X7 gun has a spring close, so the air opens and then spring closes. So if we lose our compressed air supply, the gun will still close. So now we can remove the main piston. We have 3 O-rings on here. The main piston O-ring, inspect them for damage. If there are any nicks or anything, we can certainly replace those O-rings. Okay, so now we have to remove the 2 screws, and then the rest of the cylinder will come off of the handle. So we have 1 screw here. Okay, so we have the 1 O-ring here, and we have an O-ring here and an O-ring here. So there's the 3 O-rings between the handle interface and the cylinder. This is the clean off air. We're going to make sure the needle's clean and that the seal is intact. Take a look at the cylinder bore and make sure everything's clean, all the dirt can be rinsed out of there, and it'll be ready to go. We'll adjust the valving rod position when we get the gun back together. So now we'll dig into the trigger spool. We have a 1/4 inch shoulder bolt and an elastic stop screw that we have to remove from the trigger handle. I like to put these back together so we don't lose them. Go over here with the handle. Okay, so what I want to do is remove the 2 plugs into the back of the handle. And we have the smaller plug. This will allow us to get a good look at the passageway and make sure there's no obstruction. We have these screws that we can also drill the handle if we have a gun that won't trigger. So we can remove all these access machining port screws and then drill the handle out. At this point then we can remove the trigger and the valve liner. So we have the retainer. Just take a couple of screwdrivers and very gently get the valve spool moving. We usually can grab with a rag from there. So what we have here is we have the spring. We have the spool with 2 O-rings. And then we have the valve liner, which has 4 O-rings. So we want to make sure that that bore is good and clean. And then we can just poke out the spring retainer. When we go to put this back in, we want to make sure this recessed bore is going to be able to hold the spool, and don't put it in this way. Okay, so that's pretty much the air section of the gun. We can go ahead and get things cleaned up, replace the O-rings that need to be replaced. We always recommend genuine Graco parts because we use O-rings that are really designed for the high temperatures and the chemicals that we're spraying today. Kind of taken apart, cleaned and inspected. We're going to go ahead and put this air side back together, and then we'll go through adjusting the center line and the valving rod and the PCD and retainer. Okay, so we want to make sure that the recessed bore, not the flat, is out, because it will retain the spring and spool. So when we drop that in, make sure it doesn't flip over on us. Tap that to the bottom. Okay, so now we can take some fusion lube on these O-rings. So the notch side will go into the handle bore, so we need to put the spool in. The set screw for pushing against the trigger, it goes out. So we first want to put that spool in. Then we can put the spool liner and spool and spring as an assembly into the gun. I like to take a 3/8 deep well socket and just make sure that spool liner is all the way down. Make sure the spring return is working well, then we can go ahead and put the retainer on. We'll lube in the threads, that way if it crosses over, we'll get it apart again. Passageway screws back into the back end of the gun. Small one goes first. Slide that up. Then the larger one. Okay, so now we can return our trigger, the shoulder bolt, and elastic stop nut. Bring that just snug so it won't pinch the valve. Okay, so the spool is back into the handle. Now we can attach the cylinder to the handle portion of the gun. We just want to put some grease on the 3 O-rings. The 2 here and the 1 there. What I like to do is get the handle cylinder front screws in. We're not going to tighten these all the way until we get that rear cylinder clamp and screw lined up. Just going to bottom them out. At this point we can put our piston back together. So grease in the grooves. This one has a step. So now we're just going to move up these O-rings really good, a little in the cylinder. When we're looking at this piston, one side's flat, one side has the machine bore. This is the side that goes out because it will retain the spring. So we want to make sure when we put it in, we get the orientation of that right. So now we can add our spring, replace the O-ring on the rear cap. We'll go ahead and tighten that cap up. Okay, so at this point we're going to put the clamp and screw. Remember, the flat goes against here. The chamfered edge is going to catch the cylinder rear cap lip here. Gonna hold it in place, get that started. Before I totally snug it down, I just like to make sure it's sitting in the recess quite nicely. We can just snug that up. Okay, now we have to remember we got to go back and fully tighten these front screws in. Snug them down. Okay, so that's the air cylinder back together. Before we go ahead and put the center line and the gun block back on, we want to back off the front cylinder stop. So we need to loosen the cylinder stop nut. This holds this in place. If we don't loosen that up, we're going to tear up the threads on this brass front cylinder stop. So now what we want to do is we want to turn it clockwise and facing the front of the gun. That's actually pulling the cylinder stop back. That's going to position this valving rod so we're not going to hit the PCD and damage into the valving rod, and then we'll adjust that up to the tip once we get it started. So at this point we can just set this aside and we can get our gun block back together, then we'll put our valving rod in and make that adjustment. So again, remember we have an A side and a resin side. The notch indicates the ISO, so we'll just go ahead and start with the resin. We have the screen screw, it's clean. We got the check valve seal assembly and the screen screw seal. Okay, so we're going to put a little bit of fusion lube on the threads, thread the back into our gun block. We'll fully snug that up once we get the gun block back onto the handle. Screw back on. Check valve assembly and seal. Slide that in. Now we can put our rear seal and retainer back in. Snug that up. We're just going to put the adjustment on loosely because we have to get the valving rod in there. We want to make sure this port is clean to the air clean off and the port that corresponds. A little white coating of grease. Carefully get that lined up to the handle. Going to snug that down. When we go and get everything back together again, we'll loosen that up, trigger a few times, and they kind of call that centering the center line components of this gun. Okay, so with that, we need to return our air supply, but before I do so, I want to make sure that I get the clean off air valve back into the side of the cylinder. Just leave that off. That'll be our final adjustment. So again, we're going to want air, and we want to trigger that cylinder so we can put the valve rod without putting extra pressure on these threads when we go to assemble. We're just going to trigger the gun. A little bit of lube on the valving rod. A lot of the guns, the original design, this valving rod was two pieces. They had the drawbar and the rod. If they're still in good shape and continue to use them, you replace them, they'll come as this one-piece valving rod. That's started. Trigger the gun. I'm just going to bring that tight. Okay, so at that point, we can put our safety stack back on, but we're going to leave it in the open position because we're going to need to trigger the gun to get our module back on. We need to get the front seal into the seal retainer. Kind of has a bit of an interference fit. It should fit in there. I'm going to go ahead and get these other components ready. So we have the module. Before we return the module, we just want to make sure that all the ports are clean. This one actually has 4 ports on the ISO and 4 ports on the resin. It's good and clean, okay. And we can trigger the gun. The module in place. The front seal and retainer. Okay, so you can see the valving rod's actually farther back. We'll have to go ahead and make that adjustment with the front cylinder stop. We want the air on while we make this adjustment so that we know that that piston is all the way forward. So again, make sure the top stop is loose. And then we're just going to place the PCD on, turning it counterclockwise from the front view. This is actually moving the rod. We'll actually kind of feel that PCD spin when the rod makes contact. Okay, so we're actually there. Back it off about a half a turn. So I went just a skosh far. If we got it just to make the contact, then we'd go about a quarter of a turn. We're just going to go ahead and trigger that gun. Make sure that that rod's not touching the front retainer. So we'll go ahead and trigger and hold. Now we can put the PCD retainer. I'll snug that up. Okay, at this point what I want to do is make sure that I tighten my top nut. Just kind of snug that up to hold that front piston stop in place. Remember I said we wanted to go back, and so we're going to loosen that screw, kind of just bring it tight, trigger a few times, make sure it's snug, and then at this point we could go ahead and tighten our rear packing nut as well. So snug that up. Good. We can return our stop on and remove our air supply. And remember, we want to go back and snug the screen screw cap now that I can get a little leverage with the gun. Be overly tight, but we don't want them to leak. And the last thing to go on are the manifold gaskets and the air cap. drilled on there. We don't need to get pliers overly aggressive. Get these started. Jake takes a little tap to seat them. They don't come off. Then if we're going to store the gun, I'm just going to fill those ports up with grease. Otherwise, we can grease the front of the gun, adjust our clean-off air. So you just about a turn or so, and then we'll be ready to spray. Return it to the gun manifold, and it's going to be ready to go. Today we're going to take a look at the G-X7A gun. This is a mechanical purge gun where the valving rod shuts off the fluid flow and also purges out the material. It mechanically forces it out. You still have air to keep the front end clean. The daily maintenance on this essentially is just making sure that the rear packing nut is tight so we don't have any leakage. So we're just going to put air to the gun, open the safety stop. You can tell you're open because the red band will be showing. We just want to trigger the gun a few times, snugging up this rear packing nut, which is right here. It doesn't have to be overly tight. We don't want to stop the movement of the rod, but we just want to make sure that it's not going to leak on us when we get started. And then we should be ready to spray.